You've never been afraid of humans? I asked, loading up my fork with rose tuba. Not really, I've worked with at least 20 of them in my career and met many more. Never been scared, Gale said. Sure, they're physically intimidating, but nothing compared to that pissed-off Vash security officer. Hells, we even served with a few of the same ones. Don't tell me you thought old Sparks McCallan was scary. Now, Callan Sparks McCallan had been the engineer aboard the Lutiana back when Gale and I had briefly served together on her. He was one of the oldest, craziest, drunkest, skinniest, untidiest, most borderline unemployable humans either of us had ever met. For unfathomable reasons, all human engineers like to be called Sparks and called their captains Skipper or Skip in return. And like all humans, pretty much a magician when it came to technology. Gale, my very good friend old McCallan, was the single scariest human I've ever met. You just moved on to the Exifer and before it showed, that's all. I said. Gale laughed, his glottal ligatures clattering. 10. The scariest thing about McCallan was that whiskey he drank. I dipped my finger into it once. It took a week for my claw to harden again. For those of you who were unaware, attempts had been made early on to ban off-world humans from obtaining ethanol after certain incidents that were to be regretted. It didn't work, of course. They just covertly manufactured it from way to ever they could get their hands on. And when your freighter is 2 cubbled long and has a crew of just 40, there's a lot of forgotten spaces to hide things in. In the end, the Galactic Council just gave up, declared it a cultural thing and taxed it, apparently repeating a path human authorities had trodden for centuries. I didn't mean physically scary, Gale. I meant the potential they have, that little kernel inside them all that can result in them doing something so outrageously deadly that it beggars belief. Something that no sane Sophon should even contemplate. Hells could even contemplate. Something that you can't really comprehend unless they sit you down and explain it to you a couple of times, because it's just so absurdly lethal, and yet devilishly cunning. Gale had clearly noticed a change in my expression, my pheromones giving off a mixture of contrary signals: sorrow, terror, astonishment, pride, shock. Hell's even amusement might Burrow forgive me. Let me tell you what happened aboard the Lutiana a while after you left, I began. It had been over a cycle since Sparks had joined the Lutiana. The first human engineer we'd had, also nicknamed Sparks, didn't last long. He got his high assert 2 decades after starting and took a more lucrative job aboard a passenger ship. Took us nearly half a cycle to replace him. Our systems held together with wishes and hopes during that time. We couldn't work on anything he'd marked as human modified. All mods were superbly documented, mind you. He was a consummate professional. It was just strictly forbidden by Galactic Council statute. Anything a human modified was pretty much incomprehensible to our engineers, because they no longer conforming to the Galactic Library standard designs. Guards, I hated the GLSD sometimes. No new commits on any design in 3,000 cycles. Nothing new. Not even slight improvements. It had become so bad that nearly a quarter of species actually regarded the designs as sacrosanct, religious texts, even to some. The Harmonts were the absolute worst, of course, literally worshipping the authors of these designs. Anyway, it had been many thousands of cycles. Dozens of generations of our engineers doing nothing more than calling up the approved GLSD spares in the printer, printing them off, slarding the new assembly into place and switching it back on. What few scientists we had still understood the principles. Sure, but no one learned how to design or engineer anything anymore. Why bother when someone who'd been dead for 100 millennia had figured it out and written it all down for you? Human engineers were employed on ships because uniquely they could modify things, improve them, repair systems that were too large to print new assemblies locally, and generally tinker. Even that word has no equivalent in most GC languages. Sparks McCallan was one of the best, at least by that strange measure of innate mechanical understanding. He had come aboard, spent 5 minutes leafing through the data slate of his predecessor's few modifications, picked up his toolkit, and disappeared into the innards of the ship for 2 whole-decker days. No one saw him in all that time, save for a couple of visits to the food vending machines. But after a grain run to Alcarsa 6, we restarted the engines to find them somehow 25% more powerful and 15% more fuel efficient. As I said, magicians. That was why humans could command the 4X standard. We were contractually obliged to pay them. Of course, given the shortage of human engineers, we were glad of that collectively negotiated rate. Gods know what they would be paid if competition had been allowed. After the initial improvements, old Sparks could usually be found working in his micro-G workshop on some obscure component, or it could have just been the result of an explosion in a wire factory, for all I could tell. No one really went near him, and not just because, well, human, but also his tendency to keep working while you were trying to talk to him. So you were frequently talking to his bottom half, the top being embedded in whatever unsuspecting device needed his ministrations that day. A saving grace, I suppose, as the other times I spoke to him, he usually had a mouthful of food, conversing with the only sophont predator species in the galaxy. While they're still chewing their meal is highly disconcerting to any prey species, to say the least, especially when they spit half of it back at you, seemingly for emphasis. One day, about half a cycle into his time aboard, he approached me about the loot honors weapons. "Hey, Skip, I've replaced the thermistors in that crappy ventral laser. No mods, all GL standard?" I was glad to hear that. GC statutes meant humans weren't allowed to modify weapon systems, not after the human engineer supercharging a library ship's lasers and dropping half a moon on some fanatical kidnappers incident anyway. "Okay, thanks, Sparks," I replied, dodging crumbs. "Yeah, but it's not really going to do much if it comes to the old shoot-bang fire. It barely classes as an anti-dabbery system by 2 USC standards." I could tell he was itching to tweak it, but I wasn't having anything to do with that. It would cost me my career. At this point, I made a mistake. I'll hold up my paws and admit it. I should have been clearer. I left him some ambiguity, unwittingly allowing him to exercise his human initiative and stubbornness. "Why don't you go and modify the ship's transporters instead?" I suggested. I know. Running it back in my head, I basically ordered him to do what he did, but I just wanted to keep him occupied, right of Skip. He said, with what hindsight tells me was a little too much relish. An uneventful quarter cycle later, we were on a routine run, taking a consignment of luxury ground cars to the Zeker cluster, when we received a distress signal from a Tusk tearing Union Space Command. Light cruiser, just 3 light cycles distant. Now we were technically a blast to assist, but this was a volumine notorious for piracy. There were so many potential ways out of helping that stopping was basically considered to be at captain's discretion. Sparks was the only human aboard, so I poke in him on the comm. "Bridge to engineering. Sparks, you got a blip?" "Sure, Skip, what's up?" "We've got a disc squirt ringing as a TSC cruiser, 3 LC spinward." "What's the gen on it being a Mickey?" "Forgive me." I'd been learning human tactical slang, but it still felt odd condensing a complex situation to so few words. If you can call them that. If it is, I know a TSC reatom who'll hunt him down and personally tear him a new one. Sparks replied, as best I could tell, that was a negative. I'm still not entirely sure, so we diverted to assist the stricken ship, hoping that it was genuine, and for a rather less than noble reason. The Tarn Union were known for being very generous when repaying emergency costs on their military vessels, on the order of buy a brand new ship, generous. Dropping out of warp near the Tarn cruiser, everything seemed correct to me. There in front of us at 1.7 megameters was a GLSD light cruiser design with Tarn-Arn markings and a beacon to match. Jackpot, I thought. At this point, Sparks paid an unscheduled visit to the bridge. The only time I'd seen him up here was to repair or replace systems, but it turns out he wanted to eyeball his erstwhile comrades. "Get us out of here, Skip. That's a pirate," he exclaimed immediately. I should have trusted him, but didn't want to lose the huge payout I'd convinced myself we were due. Just as I asked him how he knew we were push-hailed by well, yeah, they were pirates. Bastards. The captain was almost a caricature, a Vestrian who'd clearly watched far too many classic human adventure vids. He had planted his wild black mane, wore a leather jacket, a red sash, and, dear gods, an eye patch over his leftmost eye. Much as I'd have loved to have laughed in his ludicrous face and asked after the whereabouts of his parrot, I knew we were comically outdone. His secondary armament alone could have split us into lengthwise. Drop shields. We take control of you, ship. No resistance, no harm done you, no slavery, resist. We enslave survivors. Comply in 30 blips or shoot. The feed cut. It was at this point I noticed that, in the fuss, Sparks had quietly sidled over to the auxiliary transporter controls on the bridge. "Can I skip?" he asked with what can only be described as a grin like a Terran deep-sea predator, rising to devour some unsuspecting surface bather. "Can you what?" I asked, conscious. We had less than 20 blips left. "Use the transporter, of course. I promise it'll be quick," he replied. "Okay, but our shields are up." Transporters don't work through shields, and theirs are up too. Typically for Sparks, he took the okay at the start of my sentence as permission, rather than just an acknowledgement that I'd heard him. Somehow, over the past few decades, he'd spun my flippant "why not work on the transporter's" comment into a tour de force of human engineering magic. He'd not only managed to boost the sensors so they could penetrate shields, but somehow, and against the accepted principles of both shields and transporters, got the transporter to do the same, and then attached a Class 2 AI to them. Now attaching an AI to weapons was strictly forbidden, and had been since before. Even the Farsheet had first achieved orbit some 500,000 cycles ago. But as Sparks was keen to point out during the Lund debriefings later, transporters weren't weapons. I was reminded of the famous quote from Ambassador Cohn, the GC's first envoy to terror. "If they're determined enough, anything is a weapon to a human." I later discovered that the actual quote apparently substitutes the words sex toy for weapon. Oh, my burrow. Just then our time was up, and the pirate push hailed us again, appearing on screen in all his ridiculous garb. "So surrender or die. What is choice?" "Energizing," said Sparks flatly, the appalling rictus grin never leaving his face as he pressed a button on the transporter console. The pirate captain, along with everyone else visible on their bridge, immediately dematerialized in front of us. "What happened, Sparks? Did you transport them to our brig?" I asked incredulously. "Not quite, Skip. There were 122 crew aboard that cruiser. Our brig won't hold more than 20. 30 if their only little buggers had to put them somewhere with enough room," he said, waving his hands in circles as if to indicate more open space. My heart sank as the realization hit me. "So please tell me you didn't just space them, just like that. All 122 of them? Dear gods. I thought the Council's inquiry into this was going to last for a decacycle. Yes and no, well, yes. They're in space without suits, but not without an atmosphere. I gave every one of them 10 times their volume and atmosphere, and used the tractor beam to build an airtight field around each of them. So they're alive?" My heart leapt. Ah, no. I overrode a few safety interlocks back when I modified things, and the AI seems to have taken it upon itself to include a randomized function. Whoops. What exactly do you mean, Mr. McAllen? Well, each separate volume got completely randomized by the transporter matrix during rematerialization. My face clearly wasn't keeping up to my racing brain, so he clarified further, rather graphically. "So what you've got is 122 spheres of going by their copper-based blood chemistry. Blue mist, in space, slowly freezing. Guess that makes them easier to dispose of." I slumped in my chair, utterly horrified. "Hey," he said, "they won't impersonate a Tusk vessel again. That'll learn them." This story takes us on an exciting journey through a future world where people excel through ingenuity and adaptability. The witty banter between the characters adds a fun element, and the final plot twist shows off the amazing power of ergonomics, even if it has unexpected consequences. It's a thought-provoking tale that explores the ethical implications of technological advancements, making it both entertaining and thought-provoking. What about your opinion? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, just a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, your support, your time always means the world to me. So thank you, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.